Assalamu alaikum. Today we will discuss the reasons and the necessities behind the Arab-Israel recognition. Now this has been going on for quite some time and recently it has taken a lot of interest because recently UAE has given full support to Israel and now Bahrain has as well, and there are talks that Israel will now be fully recognized by the Arab League and the Arabian Peninsula. And we're going to discuss why, what are the reasons behind it, and what is the Arab thinking behind it. This will be focused entirely on Arab thinking. So let's get into this. So here we need to understand that Saudi Arabia's influence is waning. It's going down as the years went by. One of the major reasons behind it is, and I will start with of course, Syria. Now, before we enter into a lot of details with Syria or Iraq or anything else, we must understand that at one point, Saudi Arabia had huge influence in the Muslim world. It didn't have challengers, it didn't have rivals. The Arabs not only enjoyed a form of Muslim superiority, but also a massive influence on other nations. For example, with Pakistan and with everything else, and then they obviously with the Wahhabi influence, they were able to actually take a lot of influence. They were able to bring a lot of influence to the various areas. And if we look at the 90s, basically they had influence everywhere. They had influence with Saddam, they had influence with Afghanistan. The Taliban ruled them and they supported the Taliban. So they had a lot of influence, especially with Pakistan. Now this influence is waning. And there are some aspects of it that we must understand. For example, in both Syria, Iraq, and Palestine and Qatar, this influence is in a form of a downfall. Now, the major instrument that people often don't understand is that a form of influence is not just religious, it's also the amount of funding you give to religious fundamentalists, to religious aspects, to social aspects and social unities as well. Now, in Palestine, the biggest issue was Hamas. Hamas recently started gaining a lot of popularity due to the Israeli attacks on the Palestinian lands, due to their brutal tactics. And because of this, Hamas's continuous stand that we need to fight, actually gave them a lot of credibility amongst the Palestinians, despite the rise of Fatah. And the point is that the points of Yasser Arafat, which were basically based on liberal, peaceful negotiations, they were getting nowhere. And Hamas offered a more military solution to a people that were oppressed. And Hamas found its support with Iran. Iran supports Hamas at a great deal. Due to this, the Arab influence has been going down greatly amongst the Palestinian people, and they see this cause as no longer their own. They see Iran as being the main driver of the Palestinian cause, despite Arabs being the ones that brought the two-state solution forward. But Israel no longer cares about the two-state solution. And due to lack of Israel's care, the rise of Hamas, the Arabs see their own influence on Palestine falling. And it's falling a lot more because one portion of Palestine is completely under the control of Hamas. They are the de facto rulers over there. You see a broken ally that has no international pull. And that half of that ally, and a huge number of that actually, is now with Iran. And we need to understand, and I will talk about this later, the entire Iranian and Saudi Arabian influence fight. They are fighting as well, but we first must understand why the Arabian influence is falling down. Why do they feel that they are no longer able to have that level of say that they once had, and due to which they need Israel? And I want to get into this thinking. So the first thing we need to understand is that the rise of Hamas in Palestine has made them rethink their Palestinian policy. And as Hamas grows stronger, its attacks on Israeli forces, it attacks on Israeli mainland, and its continuous attempts to defend the Palestinian people. They see that for Yasser Arafat is falling, Yasser Arafat and PLO, they're all falling apart. They see that Fatah is unable to actually bring forth any greater military victories over Hamas, nor are they able to actually bring forth Israel towards a two-state solution where they can say to the Palestinian people, look, we brought a solution. The Palestinian people themselves are now tired of this conflict. They see this, they want an end to this conflict. Now, next point is that the Arabian influence is falling down is Qatar. Now, Qatar often always stood away from the Arabian influence, but nevertheless, it never openly went against them. Now, when the entire Yemen campaigns began and ISIS was rising, Qatar basically took forth a huge media chunk with Al Jazeera. And this was unacceptable for Arabia because they saw in the modern world that media is a huge driver of a point of view. And Qatar's continuous friendship with Iran and Qatar's Al Jazeera reporting on Yemen and the Syrian situation was basically in from Arabian point of view, from the Arab League point of view, against Saudi Arabia and the other Arab nations, the coalition. So in their view, they saw that Qatar, their influence in Qatar basically got zero. And Iran's influence was now rising up. Now here's what happened. They did a blockade, a diplomatic blockade. Nobody trades, nobody does anything, and they started a blockade. And in this manner, Iran came to their rescue. Iran, Turkey, and other nations. And Iran played a pretty important role because it is in the neighbors in the Persian Gulf. And with that, it offered airspace, it offered diplomatic relations, it offered food aid, anything that Iran could offer, they did it. And Pakistan also refused to cut relations with Qatar. We had a deal with to get more gas over from them, gas pipeline. We had the LNG deals. So what Saudi Arabia saw was that it's on its own peninsula, its influence was waning. Now, at one point, it basically saw itself as a regional player. It saw itself as the glue that held the region together, united the region against Iran or other nations, and offered the Western Bloc, which is basically US and its allies, a very stable footing in Middle East. But recently, and of course, US also allowed their influence to grow. They saw themselves them as their own footing. If Saudi Arabia's influence would grow, US influence would grow. But now its influence is fading. It is slowly getting less. And the Qatar proved that it couldn't keep its influence in its own peninsula. And this was a huge, major problem. And this must be understood, the seriousness of the situation. That Qatar itself has, in fact, not just not bowed down, but it actually fought against it. And this is very much unacceptable for Saudi Arabia. You see, in this manner, you see that Arabian influence is now getting curtailed over here as well. And this is a very dangerous situation for them. They are not satisfied with it. They are unhappy with it. And they have been trying to get Qatar into line, and Qatar has been refusing, and Iran has been rising with its influence. You see, think of it this way. Saudi Arabia basically declares the peninsula as its own. But now Iran is now making them fight on their own peninsula. And then, of course, we have the biggest issue that basically started this entire thing, the fall of their influence, which was, of course, Syria. Now, Assad basically ruled over there for years and years and decades, and the people wanted democracy. And of course, as is often now in modern revolutionary systems, foreign nations got involved and made a mess of it. Now, if you'd actually look at the back then picture, you see the red points are the Syrian government influence, the black is ISIS, and the green is basically the amount of land that Syrian democratic forces had. And if you look at it now, the situation right now, you'd see that Assad's influence is now massive. He basically controls 2/3 of the country when he had less than 1/3 of the country. It has increased over fourfold his known territorial control. This is massive, which means that Assad is now a reality over there, and Assad is under Iranian influence. You see what the Saudi Arabia were going to do is they were going to remove Iran, they were going to remove Assad, and in a sense remove Iran, and then they were going to have Assad's successor, in a sense the Syrian democratic forces, rule over there, and through that create a bit of a Sunni bloc that would basically flank Iran. And Iran would be completely flanked with Turkey, and Iran completely, Turkey would also be on their side. This is what they predicted. And Syria would be on their side with the new democratic forces, and Iran would be completely flanked out, surrounded, and its influence would be diminished. It didn't happen. Assad stood. Iran made it its personal battle to have Assad stand over there. Russia made it its personal battle. You see, after they intervened, Assad basically completely got absolute security, and Arabian influence now dies dead over there. They supported ISIS as well. They supported other Sunni militias to fight Shia militias and Syrian government forces. They exported so much weaponry and so many resources, and in the end, the result was that their influence is now dead. A lot of those Sunni militias that they had supported, they became part of ISIS, and ISIS, well, now it's basically dead, and it's basically completely defeated. And the Syrian Democratic Forces, they are unable to completely take over the country. They are stretched, they are being beaten down. Slowly, they are being taken down. And if Turkey wouldn't involve itself, the Syrian Democratic Forces would have lost to Russians. Now, Assad is a huge reality over there, and Saudi Arabia basically see that they didn't not only failed to outflank Iran, but they themselves are now getting flanked. Syria is located at the tip of the Arabian Peninsula. They are about to be flanked completely. And they see this. They see this huge reality, and it is now very worrying for them. The situation is not looking good. And in this manner, we see that another point where the influence is now dead, or at least dying. And at this point, you would notice that Israel repeatedly does airstrikes over there. Israel basically tries to take down Syria because it has its own territorial problems with them. It has its own problems, both on the aspects of what we can say, mm, protection, yeah, sovereignty and protection. So they're trying to do this. So you see, in this scenario, we have the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation that is actually making Israel a lot more appealing for the Arab world. And on top of it all, we have Iran over there, and Israel is basically completely trying to take down the Syrian government in this manner so that Iran won't come over there. So you see how the interests are lining. Saudi Arabia doesn't want Iran in Syria. Israel doesn't want Iran in Syria. So the interests are now completely same to keep Iran out of the Arabian Peninsula. You see, for this lone purpose, is Arabia has done a lot. It has done a lot of things. It has exercised armies. It has spent resources just so that Iran won't be there, and it's a huge problem with them now. You see, at this point, it must also be stated that from this position, they didn't just lose Syria; they lost Iraq as well. When the Iraq war basically ended in Obama's time and all that, there were Shia militias and there were Sunni militias. Sunni militias were completely supported by Saudi Arabia. They made sure that they were well funded. Iran supported Shia militias and they made sure that they were well funded. But the problem was ISIS. That was the problem. ISIS united most Sunni militias. And then it started the global caliphate jihad. And then it started taking everybody down. And because of that, it had to be removed by the international world. And with it, the Arabian influence went as well because many Sunni militia groups were basically targeted. Now, post that, the greatest problem that Arabia basically now finds itself completely surrounded is that Yemen. You see, as we know that Yemen used to be North and South Yemen, and then it got united, and now we have the Yemen forces that are fighting for the revolutionary forces, and then we have the old government force, and they're all fighting. You see, the revolutionary forces are supported by Iran and control most of the populated areas. And the now revolutionary group, they are trying to retake the old government. They are now trying to retake it. Now, what the thing is, Saudi Arabia notices, and most of the Arabian world notices that if Yemen falls, they are outflanked. Syria is gone, Iraq is gone, Qatar is gone now, and if Yemen falls, they are going to be completely taken down. And Oman is not interested in any combats. It is the most neutral of them all. And if Yemen falls to Iran, Saudi Arabia is completely outflanked, Egypt is open, and it's basically hell on earth. For this very sole purpose, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and all the Arab coalitions have spent no, not even a second, and invaded. They basically intervened and they bombed everything, created one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world. They asked us as well, Pakistan as well, and well, we basically stated no, which was another reality for them, that their influence is now completely endangering. Because at one time, Pakistan would not have said no, but now Pakistan not only didn't just say no, it basically said they will not commit any troops to them. They will protect the Hijaz, and if Yemen invades, they would protect Arabia, but that's it. And Yemen is no condition to invade anybody. So this basically completely messed up our relationships with the Arab world. However, the Yemen crisis basically is another proof that the influence is very much dying and Iran's influence is rising. They send airstrikes, they created a naval blockade, but somehow Iran gets in and its Shia groups get in very easily. And Iran is now basically completely creating and exerting its influence. In fact, I would say that the Iranian influence in the region is at its highest right now. You have Syria, you have Iraq, and you have Yemen, you have Qatar. The Iranian influence is basically extremely huge, and this has become a huge problem for them. Do you see, rather than outflanking Iran, they are now being outflanked, and this is a serious situation for Saudi Arabia because it feels that the Arab world is now being endangered through this. And the Arab coalition and the Arab League. At this point, it must also be stated that we must come to a little bit of Pakistan as well. That Pakistan has been recently trying to establish relations with Iran, but it has been trying to repeatedly highlight to Arabia that it doesn't mean that just because they're establishing relations, they're joining a camp. We have highlighted that we are not part of any camp, and this has been quite true, frankly. Our actions speak as much. We are not part of any camp. We have tried to mediate, which was met first with great anger by the Arab world, and later on we did ask them to sit down and mediate this situation. So you see that the Arabian influence on Pakistan is falling, and if your influence on Pakistan falls, your influence on Afghanistan falls as well, because Pakistan has huge influence in Afghanistan. It's not just the Pashtun Union that's the massive influence. It has Afghanistan is basically backyard of Pakistan. It is part of Pakistan. It is an extension of Pakistan. Its links to Pakistan cannot be denied. And Taliban is another link. And Taliban was linked to Arabia through Pakistan and Qatar. And both these countries are now out of Arabian influence. Then, of course, we have the second biggest problem. Recently, a new Muslim bloc has risen, which is being led by Turkey. Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia as well, I would say, and of course Qatar. These nations are now starting a new coalition which is opposite to the Arab dominated Muslim coalition, and they're basically saying that we are the new power bloc. You see what this is? This is basically a reality that Arabian influence in Turkey is now zero, and on the Muslim islands, which is basically Indonesia, Malaysia, Maldives, is very little now. And this new bloc basically contains that the Arabian Sea is now basically lost to them. You see, you need to understand, at one point they ruled the Muslim world. They were the center point of the Muslim world. And I'm not talking the 7th century, 8th century, or 9th century. I'm talking the recent ones. They held huge influence in the Muslim world. But now the influence is basically falling apart. And of course, in this game, we cannot ignore China as well. China has recently signed a $500 billion deal with Iran, which has been a shock for Arabia. And they're saying that we're going to build and we're going to connect you with Pakistan. And Chinese influence in Pakistan is rising every day. And basically, what Pakistan is saying is that we're part of the Eastern camp, and the Eastern and Middle East is not part of the Eastern camp; it's part of the Western camp. And with Chinese growing influence, Arabia will basically finds its influence in Pakistan diminishing, and Iranian influence rising. Because you see, the development, the trade, this $500 billion deal, is going to be linked with CPEC. And with this link, Pakistan, Iran, and China, they're going to be a central focal point. Now, Arabia has not been happy with Pakistan because of Gwadar as well. Pakistan has been trying to build a port, and UAE has not been happy. And at this point, due to these many factors, you see, in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, they were a huge central point in the Muslim world. However, now they are not. They are struggling. They are struggling in their own peninsula to create influence. Due to this massive problem, Arabs are now looking at a strong ally, an ally that can flank Iran. If if it can flank Iran, they will get their due. They will get all that influence back, and this rather than back a weaker candidate like Palestine, which is divided amongst themselves, has Iranian influence in it. Why not ally yourself with the most powerful, with one of the most powerful countries in the region that has huge influence in the world, Israel? You see, they see Israel stopping Iranian influence. They themselves are trying to stop Iranian influence. It is centrally pointed to influence. If they stop with Israel Iranian influence, their influence will return. And Israel is located at that point in the eastern Mediterranean, where it can also create a block for Turkey's influence. Turkey's influence, Iranian influence gone, and if these two influences are gone, they will be at the central point in Arabian Sea and in the Eastern Mediterranean and everywhere else. Now, I hope you like this video, and if you do like this video, then please leave a comment. And if you would like to share this video, then leave a like. I would really appreciate it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos. Thank you very much.